The rain fell hard on Hangzhou that night, washing the empty streets in silver and shadow. A young man walked alone beneath a flickering streetlight, his shoes soaked, his hands buried deep in his pockets, not from the cold, but from the weight of failure. He had been rejected again. Not by one company, but by every door he had dared to knock on. Even the local fast food restaurant had said, "You're not good enough." Each rejection carved a scar into his heart, but inside that pain, something fierce began to burn. The world had called him unworthy. Life had cornered him into silence. Yet somewhere in that silence, he made a vow, not to prove them wrong, but to prove that ordinary people could do extraordinary things. In the quiet city of Hangzhou, long before the world whispered the name Jack Ma, there lived a young man whose life was defined not by success, but by rejection. He was small in frame, with curious eyes and a heart too large for the narrow lanes he walked each morning. The air carried the scent of coal and damp earth, remnants of an old China struggling to find its rhythm in a modern world. He dreamed of opportunity the way poets dream of immortality, achingly, endlessly. Yet each time he reached for it, the door would close with a thud that echoed deeper than sound. He failed his college entrance exams, not once, but twice. When he finally graduated, the world refused to open its arms. 30 times he applied for jobs, 30 times he was denied. He even stood in line for a simple position at KFC, where 24 people applied. 23 were hired. He was the only one turned away. That night, as he walked home, rejection clung to him like the fog, thick, unrelenting, impossible to escape. The neon lights blurred through his tears, painting the streets with hues of melancholy and defiance. "Why?" he whispered to the empty sky. But there was no answer, only the hum of distant traffic and the quiet ache of a young man who felt forgotten by destiny itself. Yet beneath the sorrow stirred something ancient, something almost Roman in spirit, unyielding, proud, and disciplined. Like a fallen soldier rising from dust and defeat, he began to see rejection not as punishment, but as training. Every no became a sharpened sword, carving strength from his weakness. The empire he would one day build was being forged in the fire of humiliation. He began to read, not just books, but people, stories, failures. He listened to the rhythm of markets, the pulse of technology, the silent cries of those who, like him, had been overlooked. The more he learned, the clearer his vision became. Success was not given to the chosen few, it was seized by those too stubborn to quit. Years later, when reporters asked him how he endured so many rejections, Jack Ma smiled, a soft, knowing smile that carried the wisdom of a man who had made peace with pain. "If you've never tried," he said, "how will you ever know if there's a chance?" In that moment, his story ceased to be just his own. It became a vintage parable for dreamers across generations, a tale that awakened something noble and timeless within us all, the courage to stand tall after every fall, to rise not because we are destined, but because we refuse to kneel before defeat. Would you like me to expand this tone into the next turning point, the spark of defiance, in the same vintage, cinematic style? There comes a moment in every broken man's life when the silence after failure becomes deafening. For Jack, that silence was no longer grief, it was a call to arms. The years of rejection had not shattered him, they had tempered him. Like iron in a blacksmith's flame, his spirit began to glow with the quiet rage of defiance. He looked around his modest home, the cracked walls and flickering light bulb mocking his dreams, and whispered to himself, "If no one will believe in me, I must become my own believer." That was the night something ancient stirred within him, a force that did not belong to modern ambition, but to the timeless will of men who refused to bow before fate. It was his inner Roman, the voice of resilience and discipline that speaks when the world falls silent. Jack began to carry himself differently. He woke earlier, read voraciously, practiced English with tourists by offering them free city tours, learning from their questions more than any classroom could teach. He was not chasing money anymore, he was chasing wisdom. Every word, every encounter, became a small rebellion against the destiny that had labeled him ordinary. It was in these quiet acts of defiance that his transformation began. He no longer sought approval, he sought purpose. He had learned that greatness was not bestowed, it was built, brick by brick, upon the ruins of disappointment. And like the architects of ancient Rome, he laid his foundations in patience and persistence. In those days, when people laughed at his broken English or mocked his ideas about the internet, he would smile, a calm, knowing smile that concealed a storm. His heart was no longer the fragile vessel of a dreamer, it had become a fortress. Rejection was no longer an enemy, it was a tutor, chiseling away at the man he had been to reveal the man he was destined to become. Jack's defiance was not loud. It was not a battle cry shouted from the rooftops. It was the quiet decision to rise again each morning and push forward one step at a time. And in that stillness, he began to shape the unseen ideas, connections, courage. The world did not yet know it, but a revolution was being born, not in the grand halls of power, but in the humble heart of a man who refused to surrender. From that spark of defiance, a flame would one day rise bright enough to light millions of dreams. There are dreams that come softly in the night, and then there are dreams that roar through the silence, demanding to be born. For Jack, it was no longer enough to survive rejection, he wanted to build something that no one could reject. The year was humble, the world uncertain, and China was still awakening to the power of the internet. But where others saw confusion, Jack saw destiny whispering through the wires of a new age. He gathered a handful of friends in a small apartment. The room was dim, the air thick with the smell of tea and dust, but there was fire in their eyes. They had no money, no connections, not even a proper business plan, only a dream and the courage to chase it. On an old, humming computer, they began to shape what would one day become Alibaba. It wasn't born of privilege or prediction, but from sheer defiance of limitation. When Jack spoke to his small team, his words carried the cadence of a general before battle, steady, certain, alive with conviction. "We are small," he told them, "but the ocean begins with a single drop. One day, the world will trade through us." They laughed, not because it was foolish, but because it was impossible, and yet they believed him. His certainty was a beacon in the fog of uncertainty. In those early days, Jack faced mockery from those who couldn't see beyond their ledgers. The internet, they scoffed. It's a toy for the West. But Jack stood like a Roman sentinel before the gates of doubt, unyielding, unshaken. Each obstacle became a stepping stone, each failure a new lesson carved into the marble of his will. He lived simply, ate little, worked endlessly. The glow of the computer screen became his companion deep into the night. The dream was fragile, often on the edge of collapse, yet it endured because it was no longer just his. It had become a cause, a rebellion of hope for every ordinary person who had ever been told they were too small to matter. When the first spark of success flickered, a single international client, a single sale, it was not money that filled his heart, but validation. He had built something from nothing, and in doing so, had rewritten the meaning of impossible. That was the moment his inner Roman fully awakened, the moment he realized that empires are not built on stone, but on belief. And in that small apartment, amid wires and whispers, Jack Ma began to build his own empire, not for conquest, but for purpose.